Hey Tyler,
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. It's really early this morning.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This was the only time I could kind of manage it within this period.
That's fine. It's like I had to set up like an alarm clock and everything for me to wake up.
Oh, geez, sorry.
Like, what time is it there?
Here it's one.
Uh,
So we're kind of okay. But
okay.
I basically slept in as well this morning because had I had work last night pretty late. So yeah, I kind of took advantage of the fact that I'm starting at one. So I think I slept until about 11.
Like, how long have you been an ex-Muslim?
I'd say October 20. Oh, let me remember. I mean May 2014. So I think May 2014, April 2014 was the time when I kind of realized at the end I was like, okay, yeah, I'm no longer a Muslim, and I was happy to say that. And I had had doubts the October before that, so my doubts began around October 2013.
Mm,
And yeah, and basically those months in between. So we're talking roughly 6 7 months. That was a period of intense research, where it just kind of became a slippery slope. Every time I tried to look for something to explain something, you kind of discover a few more flaws along the way.
right.
And so it became an impossible task to kind of reconcile everything. And after a while, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks in after my initial kind of, shock at certain aspects, which led me into this journey,
Mm,
I kind of started looking at it and thinking, okay, there is no way on earth that I can say to myself anymore that this is the right religion and it's a perfectly preserved religion. Those two don't go in hand because of what I'd seen. I'd seen stuff that blatantly is wrong, and I could potentially still save the religion in my mind, if I'd lied to myself and said, look, maybe it's just these certain aspects that are wrong. Maybe the rest of it is right, and it's wrong to assume that all of it was preserved. No, it clearly wasn't. When I'm saying preserved, I'm talking about the Quran, because that's a general belief within Islam, is that the Quran was preserved and everything else was allowed to kind of slip. So the
mm,
Bible and the Torah,
mm,
the Gospels and the Torah were allowed to kind of slip, and become, subject to human intervention and changes.
right.
So yeah, I mean, it's actually not true. The Quran doesn't actually say that, but and I'll hopefully be making a video topic on this at a later stage. I think it's quite important because Muslims often repeat this argument. Um, it's based purely on as it says so in the Quran. So it's ridiculous, Yeah.
And prior to you being ex-Muslim, how long have you been a Muslim?
Oh, over 30 years. So a
Wow.
long time. Yeah, I wasn't. I often hear people who are non-believers or atheists who say, "Yeah, I was 12 or 13 or 10, and I realized it was ridiculous." Or sometimes you hear people saying, "I was 5 and I realized it was ridiculous." And and I kind of think to myself, I think, "Wow, well, good for you." But I don't know how much you can kind of really understand at that age.
Yeah, like when I hear
Yeah.
people say like they were atheists since they were five, I'm like, really? You actually were that smart to realize that?
It's not a question of being smart. I think it's a question of being raised in a particular household. So, for instance, I had two kids,
Mhm.
and the younger one is just past 5. So he's basically come to me and said, "Look, I don't believe anymore," because I told him this is my position. I haven't really indoctrinated him or forced him into the position.
Mhm.
I don't want to do that, because at the end of the day, I want them to make a rational decision based on their own reasoning. If they're fed something that they don't really understand, um, it's going to be built on weak foundation. So,
Right.
it'll leave them exposed in the future, if somebody comes along and fools them into a particular dogma. Um,
Were you relate like raised in a religious household?
I was, yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, my household was religious. My extended family, are kind of, also quite religious.
Mm.
So yeah, it's difficult. That's the thing. When somebody says, "Hey, look, I was 5 and I left it," I think what does help realizing it was false at 5 is people around you who don't really take it seriously. But if everybody around you is taking it seriously, I don't think it's that simple and straightforward to kind of figure it out, because you'll have certain questions even at an early age. You'll say stuff like, well, why is there something that's hell? Why is there a judgment day? Why are we the only true religion? Everybody else.
Right.
So you will actually ask very smart questions when you're young, but the people around you, because of their beliefs and faith, they'll give you answers, and because you would trust your parents, no matter what, because you kind of, we're evolved that way. You need to trust the elders to survive. So you
Right.
trust your parents no matter what, and when they give you an answer, however irrational it is, you can't. I don't think you're at a stage where you can kind of figure out what rationality is and what reason is and um, what a logical fallacy is. You're okay when somebody says, yeah, the Quran is preserved because it says so in the Quran. So yeah, these are things that you kind of catch on to at a later stage.
Right. And like,
Yeah.
were your parents from the Middle East, and you were raised in Britain this whole entire time?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't actually born in the UK. I arrived in the UK at a later stage. So I was an immigrant. But yeah, we kind of did it the formal way. There was no dangerous journeys across the sea back then. We had a visa, and we kind of came to the UK, and we asked for asylum,
Mm.
and we got it. So
Like,
yeah,
do you mind what Eastern country were you from?
Iraq.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Like I remember seeing like a picture of Iraq, and they had all these women in burqas and hijabs.
Yeah, yeah, but it isn't. I mean, Iraq for a while, the Middle East in general, in the 70s, 60s, and 70s was quite an open place. It was quite secular.
Right.
You didn't see that many hijabs. You didn't see, burqas in Iraq. I think even today, they're very uncommon. They're not that common. But what we mean by burqa is full covering, so not even the eyes showing.
Like, what's the
Um,
different types of covering?
so you start off. Let's start off with the basic one, which is hijab.
Okay.
That just covers it covers the hair and the neck. So all you can see is the face
Mm.
and the hands from the wrists downwards. You can also see potentially you can see the feet from the ankle down if you were inside a home or somewhere, because people aren't going to be, the women aren't going to be barefooted outside.
Right.
But that's the limit. The limit to a regular, let's say, an orthodox common Muslim hijab is that you're allowed to see the face,
Mm.
you're allowed to see the hands, you're allowed to see the feet. And interestingly, even the women who cover up beyond that aren't allowed to do so in the Hajj. In the Hajj, it's explicitly stated that you cannot cover your face and you cannot cover your hands. So you can't wear
Mm.
gloves and you can't wear the niqab or a burqa in the Hajj.
Mm.
So that's actually, it's a bit of an odd rule, given that Muslims generally today like to cover up more than they have been told to. They think, oh, covering up is a good thing, therefore let's overdo it. Let's go the full mile.
Like
The,
when
the,
they
the, the whole
like
9 yards.
right, like when they cover up, like, isn't it because they don't want like men to lust over them?
I think that's the purpose of it. I think that the purpose of it is that. But I think it's a bit of an odd way to look at things. When you're younger as a Muslim, you kind of accept that as being a logical thing and as being like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And they have these kind of memes around in the Islamic world, which they put out very often. And any ex-Muslims will be familiar with these memes of like this lollipop that's covered, and then there's no flies around it, and then this lollipop that's uncovered with lots of flies around it.
Right.
To try and tell you, hey, look, if you're uncovered, you're going to have lots of men around you, kind of, perverts around you, looking at you, checking you out and stuff. but that
Like,
just doesn't simply add up. You know,
like
it's
what's the origin of like the covering? Like, was it in like the Quran or the Hadith?
it's in the Quran. The origin is, I mean, let me just go quickly through the other stages so we know what the terminology is.
Okay,
So and then I'll come back to the origin.
okay.
So the hijab, as I explained, it's face. You're allowed to show your face, your hands, and your feet up to the ankles.
Mm,
Then the next stage is in places like Iran, for instance, you have something called a chador,
mm,
which is basically a very loose hijab. So a hijab which doesn't show your body at all. Well, it does, but you can't. It's kind of a wide cloak.
mm,
So it's absolutely not tight around the body in any sense or form.
right.
And that's so you don't really show your body
Mm,
your body shape. The next step, the next step is niqab, and the niqab is basically um, everything covered except for the eyes. So you have a small slit in the hijab for the eyes, or
mm,
in the niqab, sorry, for the eyes. Um, then you have like a semi niqab, which is very rare. But there's a hadith which says if you can cover one eye and you can kind of continue on in your life without uncovering both eyes, then yeah, you should do that. So it's very rare, but I think there are some one-eyed niqabs around. And then the full shabam is the burqa, which is completely covered even for the eyes, and you have a small mesh allowing you to see your way forward. Probably not very well, and you might be tripping over yourself a bit, but I don't know. I mean, it's the burqa is something that was kind of introduced in Afghanistan,
mm.
and it's common in Afghanistan, and I think now it's common in Pakistan as well. It's not that common outside those two countries, as far as I'm aware. I mean, in the Middle East, it's not that common. Maybe it's catching on slightly now, but it's not in the same. The traditional burqa that they have over there is blue in color. The
And
one that we have in the Middle East is kind of all black.
and prior to like Islam, like was the niqab and all the other kind of head coverings like predates that?
Yeah, yeah. This is the thing. So we'll this kind of falls into the uh, how the Quran tells us about hijab, for instance.
Okay.
So in the days prior to Islam, in the hot desert environment, both men and women wore covering on their head. So they didn't wear it for any kind of religious purpose. They wore it because of the climate at the time. It was sensible for them to do so outside. It
Mm,
wasn't something that was worn indoors, even in front of strange men. So what you had is covering to the hair that was pre-Islamic for both men and women whenever they leave the house. What happened was, you were asking how did it come into force.
mm,
Um, there's a companion of Muhammad who is called Omar ibn Khattab. He was the second caliph of Islam. So after Muhammad died, there was Abu Bakr and then there was Omar, but they were both friends of his,
mm,
and he was a very he was a very traditional conservative guy. And he would actually, according to this is based on the hadith. According to the hadith, one of Muhammad's wives was quite big um, in stature, and back then they would basically have to go to the loo outside, so they didn't have any toilets indoors. The only toilets they had were outdoors, and I don't know whether they were kind of there was the proper proper walls so people could kind of go inside and have their privacy or not. I think the thing is, one of Muhammad's wives kept on going to the toilet outside, and then Omar would keep shouting. I can't remember which wife it was now. I think it was the second one he married, which he later wanted to divorce because she was getting old and ugly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Muslims are going to contend this now, but it's there in their records. I'm not just making this up. That he genuinely wanted to divorce her because she was getting old and she wasn't attractive anymore. And basically there was a Quranic verse that said she basically begged him to stay as a wife, but he didn't have to get anywhere near her sexually, and she would give away her night to Aisha, who was the 9-year-old, because she knew that he really liked Aisha sexually. So she basically gave away her night to Aisha, and that completely falls in the face of one of the verses in the Quran. But then, lo and behold, the Quran comes and corrects this and says, look, Muhammad, if you want to spend your night here or there, it doesn't matter. It's up to you.
Right.
And to remain married is better than to seek a divorce. So he basically he was in inverted commas told by God to basically accept the deal and leave her as a wife, but just never visit her, just kind of keep her in her home, and give her the benefit of being in what was seen back then as the prestigious thing of being a prophet's wife. So anyway, I've diverged a little. I've kind of gone off topic slightly there. But when Omar was seeing her going to the loo, because she was a big woman, he would shout at her and say, I can see you, so he would embarrass her in front of lots of people and say, look, I can see you. And so he would go back to Muhammad and say, look, we need to have women covered up, because it's not right that your wives have to be the most respected here in this society, and therefore they need to be covered up. They shouldn't be exposed for people like me to see them. And initially, this is, very rarely do you have a little praise for Muhammad along the way. But according to Islamic history, initially Muhammad was reluctant to take this on. So he basically tried to dismiss this as like, just stop looking at them then, So he was I think he was a little upset with this guy, Omar, calling out his women every time they go to the loo. But what triggered it as a Quranic verse in the end was Muhammad had basically had some kind of feast at his home, and one of the people who was at his home was talking to somebody else. So they were both sat down. The name, I don't have the name with me, but he wasn't really a well-known guy. He wasn't one of the major figures of Islam. He was just one of the Muslims at the time, and he basically had his eyes on Aisha, and he quite fancied Aisha, who is the young bride. And he was talking to his friends, saying, "When Muhammad dies, I'm gonna marry Aisha." And Aisha at the time, I mean, we don't know what her reaction was, but I think she was basically going over, passing them food, and the hands would be touching, stuff like that. So, was there some flirting going on between the two? Possibly. And so basically what happened was Muhammad had basically got this convenient verse revealed to him in the Quran, where basically it said, and it's in this one verse, and I mentioned this in my 7 reasons video towards the end, the convenient verses. One of the verses I mentioned is actually this verse. And what it says is people shouldn't outstay their welcome in the house of the Prophet if they've been invited over, and they should never come if they haven't been invited. And if they've been invited, then just eat, finish, and go and leave immediately. Don't stay around and hang around for no reason. So it was obvious he was getting pissed off. He was getting a little annoyed at the fact that this guy was just sitting down in his house, not leaving, even though Muhammad had left the room, trying to kind of give them a hint. So the verse comes down and says, you've got to leave, and this is something that Muhammad won't ask you because he's a little embarrassed to say so. But God is not embarrassed of the truth. So leave the house. And the thing is, in the same verse, this is what it says: and none of you shall marry any of Muhammad's wives forever, even after he passes away. So something on the lines of that. So you have one verse which talks about people leaving meals and not inviting themselves over for no reason and being a nuisance. And then the same verse, it tells them, and you're never going to marry any of Muhammad's wives. So that basically tries to push away the fact that this guy wanted to marry Aisha. And what it also says is, do not speak to them. Do not speak to the Prophet's wives unless you are speaking to them from behind the barrier. So the word here used is hijab, and hijab is usually in Arabic it's without a barrier. So they're saying don't speak to them from unless it's from behind the barrier. And then what we have is another Quranic verse which tells the Prophet's wives to cover their chest area with their head covering.
Okay.
So this is the verse that's used to kind of tell us about the hijab. It's the head covering that I also already explained was already, predominant in the Arab world pre-Islam, and what the verse is saying is cover your chest area with the head covering. Okay. So there is actually a good argument that you could have from within Islam that says, hang on a second, have we taken this a bit too far? Is it only the chest that needs to be covered? Is it only the cleavage or something? Do we have to cover the hair? Because it doesn't specifically say you have to cover the hair. It's just saying use the head covering to cover the chest area. So it's only because the head covering is there that you're covering the chest area as well, and you're not exposing the chest.
So yeah, I mean, so it's like different ways for like a woman to dress any kind of way, just as long as it's covered your chest.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, as long as you're covering your chest, you're doing literally what the Quran is saying. But the Quran is literally saying cover it with the head covering. Okay. But the head covering was already there, and it wasn't prescribed specifically by Islam. So women who want to take off the hijab and want to stay true to the faith, they can still do so with a very mild reinterpretation, let's say. Or looking at it literally, it doesn't say that the hair must be covered. It just says the chest must be covered. But it's been taken to mean hair and chest and entire body except for hands, wrists, and feet. So that's the modern hijab today.
And did somebody write the Quran for Muhammad?
Muhammad, I mean, I don't, it's difficult to kind of say for sure any of this stuff, given that it's so long ago. But we can kind of make some educated guesses on what the evidence presents. What we do know is that when Muhammad was basically, there was, let's say, I'd say there was at least three or four people who, even from within Islamic history and just normal history, we can see had an influence. Actually, make it five, because I'm just kind of going through my head right now, trying to remember who had a potential influence on Muhammad when he was writing. So I'll start off with the five. I think one of them was called Zayd, and he would meet him in the cave where he would go to meditate. This guy was quite knowledgeable on the Torah and the Gospels, and so he was knowledgeable in the Old Testament and New Testament and what the stories of the previous prophets were. So him and also another guy called Waraka ibn Nawfal. This guy was the cousin of his first wife, Khadija, and he basically was a Christian for a while. Waraka ibn Nawfal. Can you hear me? I think yeah? Okay. So Waraka ibn Nawfal is the cousin of Khadija, and he was a Christian, and then he came back to be a monotheist, let's say. So he basically came back to the religion of Abraham, which eventually was what Muhammad was on as well. And so because he was on a religion of Abraham, he already knew what the Christians had said in their books, and what the Jews had said in their books. So he was teaching Muhammad a lot. So he got a lot of the stories of the Torah and Bible from these two in particular. I'm trying to think about I said five, and I had them in my mind a minute ago. I can think of two more. One has escaped me for a bit now. The other is I've got three. Okay, so the other one is there's a poet called Imr ibn Qais. So Imr ibn Qais had poems pre-Arabia, and some of his poems have been discovered, fairly recently in some of the really old books that predate Islam. And some of his poems, some of the lines in his poems are word. This guy lived before Muhammad. Some of the lines in his poems are word for word verses in the Quran, especially in the chapter number 54. So Surah Al-Qamar. you will find one of this guy's poems, and it's kind of, there are some verses in chapter 54 which are pretty much a copy and paste job from those. So you can see that he potentially, that he probably plagiarized some of Hamza ibn Qais's poetry into the Quran. The other two, I would say, is there's a guy called Abdullah ibn Sarh, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh, and he was basically a Muslim guy who was a scribe. So when Muhammad would get verses, he would be there writing them down on like skin, leather skin or stuff like that, or parchments and stuff, just the general stuff that they have around them. And so when Muhammad would write stuff down, this guy would start testing Muhammad. So what he would do is he would hear the verse from Muhammad, and then he would write it down differently. And then he would say, "Oh, so you said this?" And Muhammad would say, "Yeah, that's what I said." or in one case he said, فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ, which means, he heard something about the embryology. So you know how Muslims always bang on about embryology being fantastic in the Quran.
Right.
So there's this particular verse which tries to detail it in stages. And at the end, when Abdullah was taking this down, he basically heard, this is all from within Muslim sources, by the way. This isn't from outside sources. This is from within Islamic sources.
Okay.
So when he was taking it down, this guy Abdullah was listening to it, and then at the end of it, he was like, "Oh my God, that is so amazing!" Right? So he was kind of saying something on the lines of that, فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ, which is kind of like the glory be to God, the best of creators. So he said that as just a response comment to what he just heard in the verse, because he was so like overwhelmed by it. And then Muhammad said to him, he said, "Oh, that's good, add it on to the end." So he basically was like, what do you mean? And he says, "Oh, that's good, just add it on to the end, at the end of the verse, that's what it says."
Like what?
So he became very suspicious, this guy. And basically he became an apostate, because he felt that, well, hang on a second, I'm just as much as a prophet as Muhammad is, because I basically can understand what God is saying, because I can come up with this stuff as well. And so he basically left Islam, went back to Mecca.
And also just to clarify, like there are some Christians that claim that like Allah and their God is not the same thing. Like, is it the same thing?
Generally speaking, yes. I think that's a slight misconception. The thing is, they would say is that Allah is the moon god, and there is something to that, but it's not. How do I say? It's not conclusive. It's not something that we can kind of go around saying as if it's fact. I don't think it's that clear.
Like from my own personal research, it seems as though, at least from my research of the Bible, that the God that's in the Bible is actually it's called Yahweh, and that it was actually in Canaanite religion, and then it was also his own cult before going to Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
Yeah, correct. I mean, the thing is, even within the Bible itself, if you look at the work of biblical scholars, the God in the Bible has several names in the original Hebrew. So one of those names is Yahweh, and one of those names is Elohim. So Elohim, for instance, was the God of Abraham. So when Abraham was interacting with the primary God, he made Elohim his primary God, not Yahweh at the time. But then, Jewish doctrine and Christian doctrine merged all these names together and started saying, look, these are different names for the same God. We have something very similar to that in Islam, which is Allah is a name, and also Ar-Rahman. And Ar-Rahman was believed to be at the time a different deity who was further east in the Arabian Peninsula. He was somebody who was worshipped separately to Allah. And so when Muhammad was starting to kind of say, Allah was the Rahman, people started laughing at him and saying, look, he's invoking another God now. And so that brought down another verse in the Quran, which was قُلِ ادْعُوا اللَّهَ أَوْ ادْعُوا الرَّحْمَنَ أَيَّمَّا تَدْعُوا فَلَهُ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى, which means look, you can call him God or Ar-Rahman. Whichever one you call him by is the same one because he has so many names.
Okay.
And the thing is with Judaism, when you're saying Yahweh, yes, but it was also Elohim to begin with as well.
Mm.
That was the name of the first God. And if you look at the English translations, I think they changed him to the Lord instead of putting him by his name, Elohim.
Yeah, they like to say Lord God or God. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. And Elohim is fairly close to Allahumma in Arabic. And Allahumma is usually used to basically when you're saying, oh God, when you're calling to God. When you're calling to God, it's not just his name. You're calling to him, you're saying Allahumma. When you're asking anything for him, when you do like prayers, sometimes you say Allahumma when you want something from him. So the thing is, Allah as a name is used by Christians and it's used by Jews who are Arabs as well. So when people say, hey, look, it's a different name, it's not really. They're taking it from Elohim as opposed to Yahweh or Jehovah.
Right.
But it's the same God in the fact that he built, he created the heaven and the earth in 6 days. He created Adam and Eve, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Noah's flood, it's all the same stories. Moses, Jesus,
right.
All the way down.
Mm-hmm.
So to them, it is actually the same God. They are talking about the same God, especially the God of Christianity who has a heaven and hell. Whereas in Judaism, you don't really have that concept stated as such.
Yeah, like if I recall correctly, like the afterlife and like in Judaism, it was actually called soul, which is actually a place where it's like not burning forever stuff.
Yeah, I think I'm not 100% sure on that. I need to research exactly what the afterlife in Judaism is.
Okay.
Because I'm not 100% sure, but I think as you're saying, it's correct. I think it's to do with not being around God or being away from God, which is kind of some modernist reinterpretation of Christians have of hell, when they say, oh, hell isn't really literally a place of eternal torture. It's just, you're tortured because you're not with God. So you're somewhere away from him. And some people say, look, you just don't have eternal life. You won't wake up after you die if you're not a Christian. So I think people try to kind of, work their way around the horrid nature of hell in their scriptures by pretending it doesn't exist.
Right, like I heard like the concept of hell actually came from like I forgot the place, but it was a place where like dead corpses were there and that their dead bodies were in trash cans and they were burning forever.
I know that there is a very similar concept of hell in the Egyptian mythologies.
Mm.
So in the Egyptian, it's very, very similar. Lake of fire,
right?
And basically you pass through stages, and before you get to the lake of fire, you are tested.
Right.
So you are basically tested in several stages, and people look at your sins, look at the good things you've done, look at the bad things you've done, and weigh it out on scales. And this is something that we see in the Quran as well. That people on Judgment Day will have their deeds and their sins weighed out on scales.
I think I lost how many. Like I think I lost how many counts. Like it says to kill disbelievers and also that they will burn. Like it's almost every other verse.
Yeah, it's quite frequent because that's the way that you're going to get people in line. So you can't really get people in line if you're not going to scare them. If you're going to say, look, this is the truth, and these are the rules that come with it, and these rules are quite tough. Pray 5 times a day, fast an entire month of Ramadan, etc., etc. Then for anybody to have an incentive to do any of this, you can say, look, you're going to get heaven if you do this. But if you don't, people might be too lazy, even if you say you're going to have heaven, if they don't know what's going to happen to them if they don't do this.
Right.
So, if you don't specify that if you don't do this, you're going to have the worst eternal torture you can possibly imagine, times 10, then you're not going to have, much of an incentive to waste your one life that you do know you're going to have, strictly adhering to something that's going to completely, ruin your life, or not entirely, but in a sense, it's going to waste a lot of your time.
Right, like in the Bible, like at least it doesn't have like you're gonna go to hell every single verse, like the Quran.
Yeah, because it's mainly in the New Testament. So yeah, I mean, right. I think it's it's because it was a Jesus thing. He well, if he existed, he introduced it, or Paul did, one of the two. But somebody introduced it as a as something to be wary of, and I think the Muslim faith took it on board as well, and that's one of the reasons why Islam and Christianity are the two biggest religions we have today in the world. Because if you threaten somebody with eternal torture, they are going to play Pascal's wager. They are, they're not going to see common sense through that. They're going to play Pascal's wager and say, look, even if it's false, at least I'm not losing out in the end. And if I believe, I'll just try to save myself from hellfire, because it just sounds like a really horrible place and I don't want to be there. And so people have a genuine fear from these stories.
Mm.
Yeah.
And like how many branches there are in for Islam?
Too many to count, but I'd say, yeah, I'll go with the main ones. I mean,
okay.
Main ones I'd say are, Sunni. If we're gonna talk Sunni Islam, there are four major schools of thought within Sunni Islam, and Sunni Islam encompasses other parts as well. I mean, technically, I'm going to go through more than Sunni and Shia, but when I'm saying Sunni and Shia, I'm talking about Sunni Orthodox and Shia Orthodox.
Okay.
Okay, and then because Sunni and Shia, you can't really be a Muslim if you're not either or. So you pretty much have to have a position on one question, and that's what decides if you're a Sunni or a Shia.
Mm.
The one question is, who do you think should have been the person to take charge of the Islamic nation after the death of Muhammad? If you answer Abu Bakr, then you're a Sunni. If you answer Ali, then you're a Shia. That's all. That's the major difference between Sunnis and Shias.
That's the only difference?
No. There's
okay.
There are many more differences.
Okay.
But if you answer that question one way or the other, then you're pretty much a Sunni or a Shia. You can't say you're something else.
Mm.
You pretty much have to have a position on this question. If you don't have a position on this question and you say, well, I don't know, then maybe you can call yourself a Muslim without specifying which type of Muslim you are.
Okay.
But it's a bit odd to say that, because then the Quran itself doesn't actually teach you how to become a Muslim. And when you become a Muslim, you need to go back to the schools of jurisprudence, and you need to go back to scholars to see how they interpreted certain hadiths, how they interpreted the Quran. So, for instance, the two biggest books of hadith are Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. They aren't really followed by Shias, because they don't really trust, some of the sources that are in there that are trusted by the Sunnis. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, there's a guy called Abu Huraira, and Abu Huraira didn't really hang around the Prophet for a very long time. So, he basically came up with the most hadiths that are authentic. And for some reason, Bukhari and Muslim, the two people who compiled the hadiths, saw him as a authentic, genuine, trustworthy source. And so when they take hadiths, they look at Abu Huraira and they think, yeah, he's trustworthy. And they keep going down the narration. And if everybody else is trustworthy, they go with the hadith is trustworthy. Mm. But if you go to a Shia, for instance, and say, look, it says it in this hadith, and he sees Abu Huraira's name in it, he's going to laugh at you, and he's going to say, well, that's got Abu Huraira in it, so it's bullshit. We don't believe this guy.
So, what kind of Muslim were you?
I was a Shia.
Okay.
So I was part of the minority in Islam. So where Shias only constitute around 10, 15, 20% of the Islamic world. Mm-hmm. So it's not that many. Shias are a majority in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, Azerbaijan. Sorry, when I said Lebanon, it's not true. It's the third, but they're the biggest group. They're the biggest group, roughly speaking. But Sunnis, Shias, and Christians are all roughly a third of Lebanon. Okay. But Bahrain, they're a majority. Iraq, majority. Iran, majority. Azerbaijan, majority. And to some extent in Yemen, I think as well. They're 55% or something. It's a different type of Shia. It's a Zaydi Shia, which is different to the 12er Shia, which is the Orthodox Shia. They believe in 12 imams. Yeah.
And do you mind talking about Wahhabism and the interpretation of that?
Yeah, Wahhabism is, I mean, the term Wahhabist or Wahhabi comes from some guy in Saudi Arabia who's Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who's fairly recent. Historically speaking, he's fairly recent. You know, he wasn't around at the time of Muhammad. He wasn't around at the time the schools of jurisprudence were kind of established. He was kind of around, and his followers were around at least, when the Saudi state was established, when the kingdom was established. And they basically struck a deal with the kingdom because they were both powerful. The royal family, who's Al Saud, so Al Saud in Arabic, is the surname of this family. And you know, Saudi Arabia is named after this family, so it's named after the royal family. When you say Saudi, it's referring to the surname of the royal family.
And so, like, Islam is like from Saudi Arabia.
Islam originates in what is now Saudi Arabia. Yeah, I mean,
okay.
It well, according to official Islamic doctrine, we're talking here. Not historically speaking, there's a bit of contention in this issue, but from an Islamic narrative, yes, Islam began in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. It's in the western part of Saudi Arabia. There's a part called Hijaz, which has Mecca and Medina and Jeddah. So in those areas, yes, that's where Islam began, according to official Islamic doctrine. But going back to Wahhabism and what makes it so lethal and dangerous, you know, as a former Shia, when I was a Shia, we absolutely hated Wahhabis, and that's one of the things that I think the West needs to kind of figure out and understand, is that when you know, it's a false equivalence sometimes. You know, when we're comparing religions, you can't compare Islam to Christianity, for instance, because of the message that the New Testament kind of gives. Yes, they still believe in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is horrendous by any account. And it's actually, in my opinion, sometimes it can be a lot worse than the Quran, because the Quran actually just copied stuff from the Old Testament, and it didn't copy everything. The death sentences in the Old Testament are far more numerous than they are in the Quran. So yeah, I mean, stoning, for instance, doesn't really appear in the Quran. It appears in the Hadith, and it's only appearing in the Hadith because it's in the Torah. And you know, because it's in the Torah, they believed that the Torah was from God, and therefore these are God's rules. So they went back a step when Jesus came and said, look, there's a new covenant or whatever. I don't know if he actually said that, but Christians take it as if there was a new covenant with his crucifixion, and that, you know, he's basically died for everybody's sins, so we don't need to follow any of the really tough laws in the Old Testament.
Right.
But the Quran kind of says, no, we need to follow the laws, you know, because it's for every time and place. And that's what makes it quite difficult to reform. Going back to the Wahhabi question. So the Wahhabis, basically, they have a school. Sam Harris always brings up Jainism as a good example. But we can also look at Buddhism, we can look at Hinduism, and we can look at all these different religions, and we can look at Islam. And we can look at how kind of poisonous it is to the mind, and how its unwillingness to reform or unwillingness to be questioned is probably what makes it more dangerous. I mean, in terms of scripture alone, I think when we look at the Old Testament, it can be even worse. When comparing it side by side to the Quran, it has more violence in there. It has more weird laws that are where people can get executed and punished for some very simple and basic stuff. But the great thing is, obviously, Jews today don't really follow it. You know, they know it would be ridiculous if they started to follow it. So the same thing I'm applying is within Islam. Within Islam, there is a bit of a broad spectrum within Islam as well, and I think we need to recognize that, especially governments in the West need to recognize that there is a bit of a spectrum. So when we're looking at Wahhabism, who call themselves Salafis, so when we hear Salafism and Wahhabism, they're kind of interchangeable terms. The Wahhabism is a slur used against Salafis by non-Salafis. So people who aren't Salafis will call Salafis Wahhabis. What the Wahhabis themselves or the Salafis themselves won't like that name. They'll prefer to be called Salafists. And they are obviously the most extreme within Islam. The reason why they're so extreme is because they follow a particular school of thought in Islam. And in Sunni Islam, there's 4 schools of thought, and one of them is called Hanbali, the Hanbali school of thought. So it's based on some guy called Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who is from Basra, who who lived like probably 1,000 years ago or something, or I'm not exactly sure exactly when he was around, but he was around, yeah, a few hundred years after Muhammad. And at that time, different schools of thought all popped into existence, you know, to use that term that creationists love to use. Anyway, so yeah, so this Ahmadi school of thought, this Hanbali school of thought, was slightly different than the others in the fact that when it assessed how to legislate, it didn't really give a shit about what the hadiths. It only gave a shit what the Quran says and what the hadiths say, and what the early caliphs said. So the early Muslims, what they had said. And yeah, so at the end of it, what they were going with is early Muslims. They wouldn't go with interpretation. So they wouldn't go with modern scholars at the time saying, hang on a second, there's no consensus in the community today that this is what it says or this is what it means. So this is the dangerous thing of the Hanbali school of thought, is that it doesn't allow you to modernize the religion at all. The word Salafist is basically proud of the fact that they are adhering to the Islam that was presented back in Muhammad's time and for the first 3 generations, I believe, after Muhammad. That's what makes it so dangerous, is that they go back really far and they don't want to give a shit or reform anything beyond that.
So, in other words, like Wahhabism is like the most literal interpretation of the Quran.
Yes, to a degree, yes. But the other thing is, Wahhabism takes the hadiths and takes the hadiths of the people who followed Muhammad directly. So the first 3 generations of Muslims, and it goes with what they said, above and beyond any reason or any kind of interpretation based on common sense. They throw that stuff out of the window when it comes to a hadith by the companions who followed Muhammad closely. So a lot of the shit that they bring up is from hadiths as well as the Quran. But yeah, the modern Salafists today, the modern Wahhabis today, are more honest about what the Quran says.
This is so scary.
Yeah.
So, how would you describe ISIS? What is their ideology?
Salafists, definitely. They are Wahhabis. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's really you can't be an ISIS person if you're not Sunni. That's like pretty much 100%. I mean, you can't be a Shia who's ISIS because you'll be basically killing yourself. But you can be a Sunni who's ISIS who's not 100% understanding that he's a Salafist.
Muslims have been known to kill themselves before, so it's not deceiving.
Yeah, that's very true. But yeah, I mean, you wouldn't last a second. Yeah.
Okay, so what is the stance of Saudi Arabia on ISIS, officially or unofficially? Like, where's the allegiance there?
Officially, they are completely against it. Officially, they say they are completely against it. They put out stuff on their national TV channels. They'll say, you know, these aren't representative of true Islam, blah blah blah. The stuff that you hear on the internet. So officially, they'll try to distance themselves away from ISIS. The only problem that they have is that ISIS is pretty much following Islam by the word the same way that Saudi Arabia is following Islam by the word. So they will kill apostates. They will kill homosexuals. They will kill anybody who criticizes Muhammad or Allah or whatever. So to try, you know, for Saudis to try and distance themselves away from ISIS is a bit hypocritical in the sense that, practically speaking, they both kind of follow the exact same ideology.
So, like those people that kill, like the Charlie Hebdo people, they were actually following what the Quran says.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, no. Sorry, not in particular what the Quran says. I mean, if you're going to take it by the Quran saying that, then it has to be slightly. It's going to be vague. I mean, what the Quran generally says is quite vague. Okay. So you know, you can have a legitimate argument by saying, look, the Quran doesn't say we need to kill people who insult the Prophet by drawing a cartoon. Obviously, you know, the word cartoon doesn't even appear there, but insult the Prophet. I'm not sure that's exactly in the Quran as a direct death sentence, but it is in the hadiths, and the hadiths for this are quite broad as well. So it's not just for Salafists or Sunnis. It's actually within Shia Islam as well. So A Shia Muslim might say, look, it's the same thing for us, you know. So I think this is actually a problem within Islam itself in general. But when we see people like the killers of Charlie Hebdo, I would put money on that. It's always going to be Salafist. It's always going to be that particular brand of Sunni Islam, because they're so gung ho in their approach. They think that they're doing God's work for him, and so they're the ones that are willing to carry out these things. I think that other Muslims generally tend to kind of look at things slightly differently. They've progressed a little bit. You know, when we say a little bit, it's all relative. But yeah,
like the moderate Muslims, like they think that the Quran is literal, but they don't act on it.
Yeah, pretty much all Muslims. I mean, I don't know. Very, very few Muslims would question the Quran itself. I haven't really come across many examples. I certainly haven't come across a Muslim in real life who has said the Quran is flawed or has additions or subtractions to it, or it's been changed. There are some hadiths actually which are quite interesting, which say that some verses didn't make it to the Quran, but were eaten by a goat.
That's embarrassing.
I know, yeah. So basically, when they say God preserved the Quran, he didn't entirely preserve it from the goat coming in and eating something. I think it was basically a Quranic verse that was under the bed of one of Muhammad's wives, and a goat came in and ate it. And so, in one of the genuine, authentic hadiths, it says that there's the verse for stoning, because stoning isn't really ordained as a punishment within the Quran. But the hadith says, look, it was in the Quran, but the goat came and ate it, so now we don't have it. But it used to be in there. And also, there's something called Rida'at al-Kabir, which means breastfeeding of the adults. So there's a concept in Islam. I think it's mainly with Sunni Islam, but I think it might be general, but I'd have to double check on that. But there's a concept where you can basically have a woman who has a adopted son, or just a random strange colleague around, or somebody where they have to work in close confines or live together in the same place, but they aren't Islamically allowed to be intermingling, let's say, because they're of the opposite sex. So in order to make the woman allowed to spend time with him alone, she has to become his mother. And how does she become his mother? She has to breastfeed this individual.
Oh man.
Yeah. So you can imagine how that's going to look. Right? And recently, this is true. Recently, the top Sunni school of thought the top Sunni school in Egypt, Al-Azhar, which kind of is the most respected Sunni school there is in the Islamic world, in terms of giving us new fatwas and stuff like that. The school in Egypt, Al-Azhar, several years ago was severely criticized for bringing up this adult breastfeeding thing back up again. They were suggesting for any women and men who work in offices, for instance, who are going to be alone, potentially, they need to, the woman needs to breastfeed them so they can kind of still be in the same room together. So yeah, I mean, it's a crazy verse, but the goat apparently ate that one.
I wonder if the goat ate some vitally important piece of scripture that was like, hey, by the way, just kidding. We were just kidding about the last 100 pages. Just funny joke, right?
The thing is, sorry.
Go ahead.
When you're saying the just kidding part, there is actually, I kind of think sometimes that this could have been said at some stage. When Muhammad was on his deathbed and he was dying, and he was towards the end of his life, and he was kind of a bit of a miserable guy, he basically asked the people around him to bring him a piece of paper. Now, a pen and a piece of paper. The problem with this is that Muslims will say, "Hey, look, this is kind of in the Islamic doctrine as well. It's not outside history talking about this. It's within Islamic history in the Seerah, which is the biography of Muhammad. They say that when he was dying, he basically asked for people to bring him a piece of paper and a pen because he wanted to give them some really important information. Omar at the time, Omar is one of the people who are around him, and I mentioned him earlier to Tyler. He was one of the instrumental people in the Hijab verse, and he basically, you know, there was 5 verses in the Quran at least where he would suggest something to Muhammad, and then lo and behold, we get a verse.
Still there? But I think he's probably gone right now, so I'm gonna just end the chat. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this conversation. I hope you guys find it informative, and I'll see you guys next time.